any of the others, particularly in the 20th century. And I think one of the reasons for this is that it's thought that Dostoevsky has had a better sense of understanding, a sort of a darkness in man that is perhaps not present in Tolstoy. Now, Tolstoy can also go into some pretty dark places in his work. But some people say that if you look at the horrors of the 20th century, then in some ways Dostoevsky is the prophet of that in a way that Tolstoy never was. But Tolstoy still has this Rousseau-esque faith in the noble savage, that man ultimately is perhaps corrupted by society, but so deep down, he's not such a bad thing after all. Whereas in the case of Dostoevsky, you really go into the depths of human depravity and evil and so on. And the English critics of John Bailey, perhaps it's an exaggeration, but said that you can imagine Dostoevsky imagining the world of the death camps of the 20th century. You can't imagine Tolstoy doing that. So I think this is one of the big differences between them. Now, there are similarities between Tolstoy and Dostoevsky as well. It's intriguing that they never actually met. You would think these two titanic figures in Russian culture would have had some connections. They were, I think, on one occasion present in the same room, but they never actually talked to one another. So there is this great rivalry between them. There was perhaps some places in their work where they are sort of engaged in polemics with one another, and certainly in the Brothers Karamazov, there's an interesting viewpoint which suggests that one of the key scenes there is almost a symbolic, encoding of a dialogue or a sort of discussion between Dostoevsky's views and Tolstoy's views. So Dostoevsky often thought of as the most Russian writer. For those of you who are sort of Russian or Russian descent, then again you might think this is sort of somewhat slanderous to assume that Russians and Dostoevskian characters are the same type of thing, because obviously you can have plenty of very sane Russian characters in literature, and indeed people in everyday life. So Chekhov would be a great example of a very so controlled and noble and dignified Russian writer, and the same in his life. The famous philosopher Bertrand Russell once said that once the Russian Revolution had taken place in 1917, and someone was asking, well, why is it that these things are happening in Russia, and why is there this race of strong government there trying to restrict freedom? And he said, well, read the novels of Dostoevsky, you'll understand why these things are going on there, that the Russians need to have a strong hand to keep them in control, because otherwise they're all like the characters in Brothers Karamazov, which again I think is complete exaggeration and unfair. But for whatever reasons, I think this this sense of Freud said that all human beings have a great deal of psychic ambivalence, this moving between sort of two poles, perhaps of sacred and profane, holy and sinful, God and the devil, and so on. But that maybe the Russians have this to a slightly greater degree, was Freud's claim, and that certainly in the mode of Dostoevsky you see this struggle, as is said in Brothers Karamazov. There's a struggle going on between God and the devil. Sometimes he uses the terms Sodom and Madonna, Sodom and the Madonna, and that battleground, the Dostoevsky character says, is the heart of man. So that's a split essentially between very strong and very different forces, is what we see, I think, at the heart of the four great Dostoevskian novels. Proust said that all of Dostoevsky's novels could be called Crime and Punishment, and that certainly is the case, that at the heart of all of these great novels there is one or indeed more very serious crimes. So it's analysis of people in extremis, essentially. And Dostoevsky's answer to people who criticized him for taking extreme examples would be to say that actually you get a better sense of what people are than by focusing on the norm, which he said you would get in the world of a Tolstoy and a novel. Okay, so there's so much one can say about Dostoevsky, and obviously there are classes just devoted to Dostoevsky at English University. I would certainly recommend that you that you take one of those if you find him intriguing. Apart from the four great novels, so Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Devils, also translated as Demons or The Possessed, Russian word Biesi, can be translated as all of those, and the Brothers Karamazov. The other perhaps the most important works would be Notes from the Dead House and Notes from Underground, but some of the earlier works, which I'll also refer to as we go through the text, are important as well. There is a fifth great novel called Podrostok, which is translated as The Adolescent, or you can say a raw youth. It's sometimes translated almost as a teenager. You can translate as well, which is actually quite an important novel as well. Okay, so I've said a bit, I think, before about Dostoevsky's life, but I'll just go over a few things which are particularly relevant to this text. So he was born in 1821. died in 1881, and his life was, again, a very extreme life in many respects, but he did at least sort of, die, okay, not particularly old at the age of 60, but he did die in his own bed, and at a place where he was valued by all of Russian society, was thought of as being perhaps, the embodiment of the Russian spirit, was a great success. Whereas Tolstoy, who in some ways had a far more stable life, was financially secure in a way that Dostoevsky never was. And this was a big problem for Dostoevsky. Obviously, he got very jealous about Turgenev and Tolstoy. He said, if I had their money, I could write such amazing books. But essentially, I've got no money, so I have to do things really quickly, just churn them out to get money. Didn't help. Of course, he had a gambling habit. So that was another of his issues. And I mentioned before how he borrowed some money from Turgenev, which it took 10 years to give back, and that's another reason for the disputes between them. But anyway, despite everything, by the end of his life, Dostoevsky is in a pretty good place in his life and in his work, whereas Tolstoy, as we said, at the age of 80, whatever, runs away from home. So it's an intriguing reversal of fortune, I think, we get in the case of both of the writers. He started off as a military engineer. His father was a doctor. One of the mysteries of Dostoevsky's life is the fact that his father died under mysterious circumstances. Most likely he was murdered by his serfs, but we don't quite know the reasons for it. Had he been misbehaving? Had he been treating the serfs cruelly? Had he taken advantage of one of the serf women? We don't really know. Was it a rumor that was spread by a jealous of landowner who wanted to grab some of his land? If there was some aspersion, some cloud cast over Dostoevsky's father's name, we don't really know all of those details. Probably what is important, though, is that in all likelihood Dostoevsky did feel that his father was murdered. So the theme of parricide, of course, will be central to perhaps his greatest novel, perhaps the greatest novel of all time, The Brothers Karamazov. But this sense that terrible crimes can happen to anyone at any time, I think, is again what Dostoevsky tries to reinforce in his works, and say that these things are in fact actually not that unusual. At least they could be happening to anyone. So Dostoevsky served in the military engineers and then retired after the great success of his first work, so Poor Folk, which was acknowledged as a masterpiece by Belinsky, the famous radical critic. When Belinsky read it, he went round to Dostoevsky's apartment in the middle of the night, 3 in the morning, knocked him up and said, this is amazing. Had lots of hopes about Dostoevsky, but then his later works, which were a bit more sort of Gogolian and also a bit more weird, didn't meet so much with Belinsky's approval. And in his early years, Dostoevsky was quite left-wing. He was a member of a utopian socialist group, which was thought for a long time just met to have conversations, and yet nonetheless just these conversations. And read in the letter that Belinsky wrote criticizing from Gogol, he was arrested. The more research has been done on it in recent years, the more it seems that perhaps within this subgroup, which in itself was an illicit organization, there was a sort of subgroup which was actually involved in sort of more daring and more dangerous political activity. So in actual fact, perhaps even though the people who arrested Dostoevsky didn't know that he was a dangerous figure, perhaps he actually was more radical, more dangerous in these early years than we know. Having said that, it seems that the accounts we do have of the conversations of this group, that Dostoevsky always had an element of religious faith about him, so it was a type of Christian utopian socialism based on a French model that he represented rather than a pure atheistic socialism. Okay, so he was arrested in 1849. I mentioned before this terrible mock execution that he underwent. The Tsar had a very sort of sick sense of humor. So the first row of 3 prisoners were tied to the posts. The firing squad was in front of them, and then at the last moment, someone rode up on a horse with the letter saying, "Oh, you've been pardoned." But by that time, one of the guys had gone mad, another's hair had gone grey instantaneously. And at that moment, Dostoevsky was the second in line to be shot, essentially. So this is a key moment in his life that he thought, I've got 2 minutes left to live, and he was looking around him. He was also thinking of Hugo's work, The Last Day of a Condemned Man, so life and literature come together very strongly at that point. And it's a theme that will recur in a number of the works. And Dostoevsky said to one of his friends, where will we be in a few minutes? And one of his friends said, we will be dust. And Dostoevsky said, we will be with Christ. But actually this faith he has that there is an afterlife, that he would be with Christ, is something that he will be interrogated throughout his work. So although on the surface at least Dostoevsky is always and increasingly on the side of conservative and religious beliefs in his work and trying to undermine what he thinks of as the greatest threat to Russia in the 19th century, which is the radical philosophy which believes that society can be organized according to rational principles which will restrict human freedom in the name of some greater economic and social plan. And Dostoevsky has always asserted the value of individual freedom to do whatever someone wants against that sort of social engineering, essentially. In reality, there's a far greater split in his work, and that split is both the benefits as well as the dangers of such a social and socialist program, and also in terms of whether, in fact, he does believe that there is ultimately, an afterlife, whether there is justice in earth or in heaven as well. So this idea of pro and contra, which is one of the titles given to books in Brothers Karamazov, that he's always arguing among himself, between his characters. His work is very important. And we see that, of course, in the name even of the main character in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov. The Russian word Raskol means a split or schism. It refers back both to a very specific religious sort of grouping of the old believers, of the Raskolniki, of the schismatics, who reacted against the religious reforms of Peter the Great, and we'll talk more about that as we go through it. But at a deeper level, the fact that, as the translator has chosen to use in the first lines of this book, that he's in two minds, essentially. In the Russian, it says in nirashimosti, he's in indecision, indecisiveness, not deciding something. The translator, rightly or wrongly, and it's quite a neat translation, has gone for in two minds. So these are two minds, whether it's about socialism as opposed to a more conservative view, atheism as opposed to belief in God, etc., etc. All of these struggles are going on in Dostoevsky's work. Okay, so after this mock execution, Dostoevsky was exiled to Siberia for a number of years, and based on this experience, he wrote this work, Notes from the Dead House, and he really came into contact there with the common Russian people, the peasants, and so on, in a way that many of the writers of his time perhaps hadn't really, in certain kinds of shared a prison cell or some prison bunks with some convicts and some murderers and so on. So Dostoevsky came face to face with extreme human behavior, and certainly this notion of whether punishment does it just act as a deterrent? Is it meant to somehow be redemptive? What is the point of a sort of penal sort of system? Is it actually to try and allow someone to be reborn or to put their life right in different ways? And what are the factors that could allow that to happen? So in our novel called Crime and Punishment, and we'll look at the terms in a moment, also the sense about what happens after punishment. Is redemption a part of that? And what type of redemption, essentially? Okay, so all of these his encounters with some criminals, I think, is relevant because he would have come into contact with people who saw themselves without knowing anything of philosophies which could be sort of proto-Nietzschean and talk about some supermen, nonetheless people for whom there seemed to be sort of no moral code at all, who would commit the most awful crimes and not think twice about it. Okay, so he did actually come into contact with people like that in prison. Okay, so Dostoevsky returns to normal sort of civilian life after this period of imprisonment and then sort of exile. His first marriage is not particularly happy, and his wife sort of dies in 1864, and he writes a famous diary entry, and I'll talk about that later, one where he says Masha is on the table, so her body is laid out before him, and says, will I ever see Masha again? And this question and this fear, is there indeed the hope of an afterlife, of a further meeting, will torment him for the rest of his days. Another key fact about Dostoevsky is they suffered from epilepsy, and Freud claimed that this was triggered by the murder, in quotation marks, of his father. It's not clear that is the case, but certainly Dostoevsky both saw his epilepsy as a blessing and a curse, and certainly before he would have the epileptic fits, he would have moments of great insight and peace and some almost experience of paradise. He describes this in his novel The Idiot, because there the hero Prince Mushkin is an epileptic, and there are other epileptics in Dostoevsky's works as well. Okay, so he he starts writing his major works in the 1860s. Notes from Underground is very difficult of text, but certainly if you get into Dostoevsky, it's one that you would certainly want to read. There, this anti-hero, one of the first sort of moderns of characters of literature, so a distorted, superfluous man, if you like, someone who will act in a self-destructive way just to prove his of human freedom, because he doesn't want to be just like a cog in the wheel. He just doesn't want to be part of a society in which it's believed that everything is determined by economic factors or chemicals going on within your brain. That's what he sees the new materialist and utopian ideas as arguing, is that man ultimately doesn't have any individual freedom. And the underground man, even at great cost himself in a sort of sadomasochistic way, will try to prove that no, he is free to do what he wants. And his famous formula, which we saw hinted at in Fathers and Sons as well, is that 2 times 2 equals 4 is a beautiful thing, gentlemen, but sometimes 2 times 2 equals 5 is great as well. The freedom to say, I want 2 times 2 to equal 5, essentially, that is my credo. Okay? So, Notes from Underground is a very important work. It's an attack on idealism, scientific socialism, ideas of the perfectibility of human society. Because if there is a human freedom, how can you decide, what is good and what is evil? Who is to make that decision? Is it just the utilitarian model? If we say that 95% of people say that this is how society should be built, then what do you do about that? And the key symbol of this is this building in London for the Great Exhibition of 1851, the Crystal Palace, which is seen as a symbol of the new world, essentially. And Dostoevsky's underground man fears that he won't be able to poke his tongue out in the society, he won't be able to do what he wants to do. So you could say that he is completely arbitrary in his wishes, but he wants to assert human freedom at the cost of everything else, essentially. So this, the importance of human freedom, this is why Dostoevsky becomes the main sort of model of the main inspiration for various existentialist writers in the 20th century, so Camus, Sartre, and many others as well. Okay, so I'll talk later about how, in some ways, Raskolnikov is related as a literary figure to Bazarov, but one of the things to bear in mind is the importance of the political context at this time. Just when Dostoevsky's working on Crime and Punishment, a couple of events occur. For example, there is an instance where a young university student commits a murder. Well, first of all, there is a robbery, which is very similar to something in Crime and Punishment, and then a murder, so it almost seems that Dostoevsky was prophetic. The things he was talking about, which people said are completely ridiculous, this is not going to happen, actually happens in real life in Russian society. And also there's an attempt to assassinate the Tsar on the 4th of April, 1866, which again sort of shows that what these new revolutionary ideas are possibly leading to is a complete overthrow, a complete sort of transformation, maybe not for good as well, of Russian society. And one of the things you'll find in Dostoevsky's novels is that, although, yes, perhaps their greatest strength is in the psychological insights into these characters, which we think of as extreme, but actually tell us a lot about the way that we are. At the same time, these characters also serve as some type of symbolic options for the development of Russian history as a whole. Okay, so which way is Russia going? Is it going in the path of the radicals, of radical socialism, utopian ideas, or is it going back to its roots, more conservative, more religious worldview? And what are the pros and cons, again, of both of those sides? So it's not to say that each of the main characters in Dostoevsky, in a simple sense, represents a political program or a social model, but we can read that into the different characters as well. Obviously, someone like Luzhin is probably as a parody of the nihilists and utilitarians. Porfiry Petrovich and Razumikhin maybe represent a more positive way of thinking that somehow liberal and Western ideas can function in Russian society. Someone like Sonia is obviously far closer to a religious interpretation of Russia. Svidrigailov, again, as we'll come on to him later, is perhaps the next stage of nihilism, and he's certainly a stage beyond what Raskolnikov represents, and so on and so forth. So I think that we'll sort of see the parallels between individual psychological states and bigger patterns in Russian society. And of course, more broadly, people have seen these as representative of other societies too. And you can see this not just in the fact that Dostoevsky's works are so often remade or rewritten in movie form in the 20th century by different film directors, French directors, Japanese directors, and so on. Taxi Driver, for example, was very much it's a variation on Crime and Punishment. The case, if you see Scorsese's Taxi Driver, Paul Schrader, the scriptwriter, said, "Look, yeah, pretty much I was trying to do a version of Taxi Driver." There you see it, of course, in the Jodie Foster character as a prostitute and other things there. Now, there's a lot of differences between Taxi Driver and Crime and Punishment, but there are similarities as well. American Psycho, also, the book and movie, also has quite a lot in parallel in comparison with Crime and Punishment. So this is a very up-to-date, very modern writer. Okay, so if you didn't know what was going to go on in the book, I mean, the rather sort of lurid sort of cover, I think, and the commentary has probably told you pretty much who's going to do what and why and how within it, and also the notes there. But I think that, as I suggested, the title is significant, not just because there's, is punishment the end of it? We know that if we have this sort of double sort of title, well, okay, so cause and effect, or trying to understand what is the reason for the crime, what type of punishment will there be, indeed, will a punishment sort of follow? And of course, one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the main punishment that Raskolnikov, if he's the criminal, there's probably some evidence that he is, will undergo there? And indeed, are there different types of punishments in the text, and are there indeed some different crimes in it? So we'll come back to that in a moment, but I think it's important also to know, those of you who don't know Russia, that the word punishment in Russian, the pristuplenie, is actually an interesting word, because what it means is like to step over, essentially. So it's closer to the words of transgression, to transgress, to step over. Okay, and this notion of different boundaries that the characters have stepping over is very significant, and actually becomes manifest in different places in the text. So, for example, there'll always be a focus on the threshold of a door, parog in Russian, that Raskolnikov will think, shall I step over into this room? So many of the encounters take place in these liminal areas, on a staircase, in the space between a corridor and entering an apartment, and so on and so forth. And the famous Russian critic Bakhtin, we will return to later on, really talks about this at some great length. And for example, later on, you see Svidrigailov, who in some ways is a double of a double. We were saying that Raskolnikov is a double, given his split nature, but also Svidrigailov is his mirror image in some ways. The first time he will encounter Raskolnikov, Svidrigailov will step straight into his room. He'll step over with no problem at all. So for him, the transgression is no big deal. For Raskolnikov, it's a far more troublesome area, essentially. So this word, I think, is pretty important within the Russian. Okay, so again, I don't want to spoil too much in it, because apart from the obvious thing that the picture seems to suggest there, and what's hinted at in the openings of pages, I think there are others of crimes. And for those of you who've sort of read the book, or at least read some of it, how many crimes are there in the text, or how many criminals are there in the text, do you think? Focus on some crime.
Well, I think something that's interesting about the name itself, Crime and Punishment, is that it can be interpreted into different situations. So, for example, like Marmeladov at the bar, his crime could be seen as wasting money on alcohol, and his punishment being his terrible home life because his family doesn't have enough money to eat.
Or even perhaps people that got their family was spotted, but other things happened to him as well, then that could also be a type of punishment. Okay, so good. Okay, so there might be other characters. So Marmeladov could be one character. Who else might commit crimes within the text? Yeah.
I don't really remember. This Svidrigailov, is the one who rapes the girl.
Yes, and so again, Svidrigailov is certainly someone who we assume has committed some great crimes. Again, the evidence is not 100% of certain, because there are moments in the text where the way that Svidrigailov reacts, for example, to a dream he has of something terrible happening, suggests a revulsion against something that's taking place. And what that revulsion is that he's thinking that he's capable of paedophilia or some rape or both, or even some murder on the one hand. On the other hand, the fact he's so shocked by this, what does this tell us? Does it tell us that only now he realizes the horror of what he's done, and that will have consequences for the way he will continue in the novel? Or is it, in fact, as I think is actually more likely, that this just shows that yes, he has done these terrible things, and up to some point it was no big deal for him, but then whether it's the awakening of subconscious or something, and he realizes that yes, he has done these terrible things. So yes, certainly Sujagala is someone whose own evil, which again there's no definite evidence for it in the way that there's definitely evidence for Raskolnikov's crimes, but we know that there are rumors about what might happen to his wife, for example. So there's another backstory with another big crime there. I think we have to assume rightly that Sujagala is guilty of some major crimes, and then the light that was shed on what Raskolnikov is, because put very simply, we can say that almost Raskolnikov is given this choice between his good and bad angels that he has to choose. You've got Sonia on the one hand, you've got Sujagala on the other, and which way is he going to go essentially, what is his true identity? Because one of the big things about Crime and Punishment is that it's often said that it's not a whodunit, it's a whydunit, and that's certainly true to some extent. But we know pretty early on who did the murder, okay? But why, and therefore the different motivations, different motives, the different ways that Raskolnikov tries to explain why he did what he did, and whether these things each in turn, they get reviewed as that's not the real reason. There's another reason. We'll talk about what the different motives might be. Or is it a combination of these things? How is it that someone who, in many respects, is thought to be a good guy, later on we'll learn that he did things like save children from a burning building, helped out his landlady's daughter when she was sick, and so on and so forth. How is it he's capable of doing what he does in this text? And there's this big dispute going on there as well. But I think we can turn this also on its head, that it's not a whodunit, it's a whydunit. But if you work out why it was done, then actually do work out who Raskolnikov is, and that's the question he wants to work out. Who am I, essentially? So it is actually about his identity as well, as a person. Okay, and then that has broader significance. You probably heard what I've always said about the murder, and that's something that Raskolnikov seems to talk about within the text, but whether in fact it's just one murder, of course, is something that we shall see. And if there's more than one murder, then why does he seem to forget about another murder in it? That's again an intriguing factor. And indeed, so much of the criticism seems to forget about the fact that there might be more than one murder. Is anyone else guilty of a crime of transgressing against someone within the text here? Yeah, so the pawnbroker, I mean, one of the things that Dostoevsky does very successfully in the text is to actually make her so unpleasant that you almost start sympathizing with Raskolnikov and his thing. Yeah, she's described in such unpleasant ways, all this like greasy hair and so on, and that her legs are like a chicken, maybe she's a bit like Baba Yaga, the Russian witch. You almost think, she doesn't deserve to live, because of all the bad things she does and so on. And then we become, complicit almost in wanting to do something evil, because Dostoevsky is so clever at writing these things that we start thinking that yes, perhaps she does deserve to die. Perhaps she's a criminal. Don't we punish criminals? Well, perhaps she should be locked up at least for what she's doing. So she can be seen as a sort of criminal within the text. And anyone else who might have committed some sort of great crime within the text. I think also the figure of Sonia, because we normally assume because that Sonia is the great redeeming figure within this of text, but at the same time, to some extent, she has committed a sin by, becoming a prostitute. And this is not to be so judgmental about it, but what she's forcing herself to go through is, is destructive of what she is as a person. Now, you could say, well, she's doing it for, to help other people, which is what she is doing, and that's to her credit. But should she have done that? The fact that when she comes back, she gives like these 30 silver rubles. Quite clearly, this is 30 pieces of silver, like the Judas of crime. So she has betrayed something, and it's also pretty much made clear that this is symbolic rather than realistic, because there's no way that she would have earned 30 rubles at that time. In the average prostitute, apparently, at that time in Petersburg would have got say 50 or kopecks or 1 ruble, a night or something like that. So there's no way that she would have earned that sort of money. It's just more of a symbolic thing taking place there. So although we see Sonia as the great heroine, the great redemptive figure within this text, at the same time maybe she too is guilty of a crime. So is she punished, and if so, what redemption can she have? And although maybe she redeems Raskolnikov, in some ways does he redeem her as well? And just one final thing. Both a central idea, but also in some ways a problematic idea in Dostoevsky's work is that it's almost you have to sin in order to be saved. That's the Russian saying, if you don't sin, you won't repent. And it's almost as if you have to do something really bad, perhaps even go as far as murder, in order